Hello and a very warm welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma and with me is Professor Harsh Pant. On this episode of the Ideas Factory, we will be looking at the virtual G20 summit, which is taking place. Also, we will look at what were the outcomes of the Brics summit that took place, the East Asian summit, where External Affairs Minister Jay Shankar has spoken about territorial integrity once again. And along with that, we will also look at what's happening in the neighborhood, which is Afghanistan. The talks with Taliban are going on, but at the same time, as the US troops prepare to pull out further from Afghanistan, we've seen an increase in the attacks, and there has been a massive rocket attack in Kabul, which is very worrying as these talks go on. Harsh, I would like to begin with the virtual G20 summit, which was hosted by Saudi Arabia. We've seen that President Donald Trump, who's still not conceded completely, did make a brief appearance, but then he went golfing in Virginia. Prime Minister Modi called for a new global index, which is based on transparency in governance. We've seen China also, like Xi Jinping spoke about defending the international order, which is interesting coming from China because in the other summits which have taken place, we have seen a worry about China's aggressiveness. So this entire the G20 summit, what were the outcomes and how do you see the focus now is on a transparent and inclusive, resilient and sustainable recovery from COVID-19? So do we see that these big countries are taking such steps? Though every country talks of country first now, about nationalism, and yet we talk about this inclusiveness and resilience. How do you see this taking shape?
Naghma, thank you. I think this is a big challenge now for the international order because countries are increasingly, especially major powers, and two in particular, America is embroiled in a political crisis of a kind, and China is challenging the system in ways that we have not seen any other power do for a very long time. So the challenge, I think, for a platform like G20 is to retain its relevance. And the fact that that Prime Minister Modi talked about transparency in governance, I think is a reflection of that unease that exists now in a large part of the world, that perhaps these platforms are not doing the kind of work that they were supposed to do. And you may recall that when earlier on in the year as well, it was Prime Minister Modi who asked for this G20 summit to happen during the early phases of the coronavirus crisis. So clearly, we have seen challenges where G20 itself has not been able to articulate the problems that global governance is facing at the moment. And it is ironical because G20 was conceived to do exactly that. The idea was that G20 will bring countries, both the developed as well as those that are emerging and those that are very important in the global governance architecture, and they would be able to have this kind of a conversation about the future of global governance. But what we are looking now is a global order that is extremely fragmented, extremely fractured, and leadership is missing. So when Prime Minister Modi talks about transparency, he talks about sustainability in the kind of economic development models that we follow, the kind of trusteeship of the earth, as he had put it. I think those are big questions, huge questions that at the moment it seems each country is grappling with individually, rather than as common sense would have it, that you have to come together to find answers to these questions. But I think geopolitics at this point is the most important variable, it seems, and countries like America, like China, are not really managing that process very well, given their domestic challenges, and given, in the case of China, a sort of a revisionist perception about its own role in the world that it has developed. So I think the challenge is huge, and G20 perhaps needs to do much more than it is doing today. And I think the fact that during COVID crisis, we have not seen a really robust interpretation from Corona crisis, from G20, robust leadership from G20, which was exactly what it was created for. I think is a bit worrying.
The robust leadership has been missing also from America, as we've been talking about. We've also seen a crumbling of the established world order of the multilateral organizations. China's aggressiveness has been on the rise. There seems to be a contradiction, Harsh, when China talks about defending the international order. China talks about, uh, you know, the focus was on making vaccines and making it available for everyone. Saudi Arabia talked about it. But there seems to be a lot of contradiction in the way the world is going forward and the talks that are taking place of defending world order with multilateral organized platforms. America has withdrawn from them. There is a lack of leadership everywhere. So there appears to be a lot of chaos than a direction where the world is heading, and where we see a combined resilience or an inclusiveness, which is the need of the hour.
Yes, and I think we all the major leaders, all major powers talk, are talking a language which is increasingly divorced from the uh, real world operationalization of their policies. So you have countries, as you point out, in the case of China, which is challenging international norms, is challenging the rules of the game, if you will, is challenging global order in ways that is unprecedented. And yet it is China that goes to these platforms and talks of, how we need a rules-based order. So it's quite, there is a cognitive dissonance here. But I think that there is also something bigger, which is I think we are all now waiting for something to emerge, say in America, for example, for America to
Yes.
resolve the crisis, and it's a domestic political crisis, and have clarity on where it wants to go. As you pointed out, Donald Trump was there but was not there at the G20 summit. So American absence is being felt, and whether we like it or not, America's role in the world has been one of mobilizing global opinion in certain directions. Now, when you have that leadership missing, it becomes very difficult for other actors to actually make that transition to this new order. So I think what we are now looking at is some of the middle powers trying to do more. For example, what I found was, if you see the speeches, Prime Minister Modi's speech was, I think, most specific in terms of what India wants from the global architecture. And I think India seems to be taking much more interest in global governance issues than some of the other interventions that we saw. Some of the other interventions were about here and now. What kind of COVID? How will you distribute COVID vaccines? What kind of health architecture do we want to create? They are all important, and they are all very immediate concerns, and we are somehow or the other we'll have to manage them. But I think there is a longer term question here about the future of global order that few countries are willing to engage with. And I think that's really worrying at this point, because we do see a crisis, we do see great degree of instability, and we do not see a clear roadmap. And when you don't have a clear roadmap, I think countries then decide either to take their own ways of approaching the larger issues. They become very inward looking, which is already happening. They become very protectionist. They become they all go for first order priority, which is let's make our national interest supreme in deciding what to do, which is not problematic in and of itself. But when it happens in the context of the larger vacuum in global governance, the challenges become so much more acute. And I think that's exactly what we are seeing in most of these platforms that have met in recent months, in recent weeks, and that we have been talking about, whether it's SCO, whether it's Brics, whether it's G20. They have been grappling with some of, I think, almost existential questions about global order, and no one seems to have any real interesting answers to the challenges that we
Yeah,
face.
but nevertheless, these summits have taken place virtually. Brics also took place last week. How would you analyze what happened at Brics? Prime Minister Modi again very clearly pointed out that the biggest problem that is facing us today is terrorism, obviously referring to Pakistan without naming Pakistan, and that countries who propagate terrorism should be acted upon. Of course, there were talks of COVID-19 vaccine and all of that. But the big he really stated it very clearly. But when you talk about the relevance of these summits or these organizations, these platforms, which have been found rather wanting, how would you analyze the BRICS summit that just took place?
I think BRICS was interesting partly because we were once again seeing, Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President at the
Face
same
to face.
table, uh, even though virtually. But I think Prime Minister Modi was also, the fact that BRICS could come out with their counter-terror approach, which was a major achievement because that has been in discussion for a very long time. The consensus amongst BRIC member states on counter-terror, cooperation on counter-terror has been long in the making. And in the past, India has been rather dissatisfied with the state of affairs. But I think Russian leadership, as Prime Minister Modi also underscored, was instrumental in producing that consensus this time. Now, again, the consensus words, statements are one thing, but we also know that while Pakistan is to be blamed as far as terrorism is concerned, we also know that who backs Pakistan most of the time on multilateral platforms, global platforms. And I think Prime Minister was as much targeting Pakistan as he was targeting China, because clearly, if major powers cannot agree on the fundamentals of the challenge of terrorism, then it is very difficult to manage terrorism as a global problem. And that is something that India has highlighted consistently now over the last few years at every possible fora, that major powers need to come to a consensus. And the fact that BRICS member states at least managed to come to a consensus is a significant development, is a significant achievement. But we will have to see how it gets again operationalized in the case of China's relations with Pakistan, in the case of China's engagement with the larger question of terrorism, because China manages to take a view on terrorism which is quite problematic. The terrorism when it is directed against China is a serious problem. When it is directed at countries like India, China manages to fudge around the issue, not articulating a consistent position, not making it clear that Pakistan should be targeted for producing and generating this problem from its borders. So I think now onus is on China to show to India that on this question of terrorism and on the question of Pakistan-based terrorism, it will rise up it from its very narrow vision of terrorism, and will appeal to the larger and will be able to transcend some of those challenges that are there in the region. I'm not very hopeful, but I think BRICS has made a good start.
And how about the East Asia Summit? When you talk about the challenges or the questions in front of China, China has also spoken here at the G20 about it being the defender of the international order. And at the East Asia Summit, we've had Jaishankar speak about the territorial integrity and the sovereignty, or pointing towards the aggression of China in this region, particularly because China remains in this region. The main threat is from China. Uh, so when you look at that contradiction, he's brought this up again while China talks of defending the international order, but the main threat in this region to each nation's territorial integrity and sovereignty has been from China.
Yes, and I think if you see Indian interventions in the last few months across various platforms, this has been a consistent theme. Of course, the theme is related to what India is facing on the borders, Himalayan borders. But I think it's also a larger question that you cannot say something just for the sake of it. As a major power, it's incumbent on China to put its words into practice. And I think the challenge, therefore, for India and for other countries is to how do you make sure that happens. So India has, for the last few months, in fact, very consistently raised this point across various platforms, across various forums. And the idea is basically to tell the world that, look, you have to uh, put into practice the kind of principles that you articulate. And for China, this is particularly important given the territorial problems that it has created for its neighbors, including India. So when India is making that intervention, whether it is Mr. Jaishankar making it at the East Asia Summit, whether it is Prime Minister Modi talking about it at the SCO Summit, I think the undercurrent is the same, that we cannot, the status quo cannot continue. We cannot continue with countries saying something but not operationalizing it in their policies. With the issue of territorial integrity, sovereignty has been raised by India in different contexts, in the context of rules-based order, in the context of connectivity, in the context of bilateral relationships, in the context of multilateralism. Unless this basic principle is followed, unless this basic principle is engaged with, international relations as they have evolved over the last few years really cannot move forward. Because the whole, the fundamental of multilateralism, after all, is that countries will respect each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. That's also in the larger sense the very basis of United Nations, if you think about it. The whole balance between realism and idealism that UN creates. And I think that's the sense that India wants to push across the global community. Of course, it is for India's own interest. It is in India's own interest that this happens. But I think there's a larger normative issue here as well, which is not simply for India, but also for other countries to take cognizance of. And I think that's increasingly happening, given the region as a whole is much more vocal about this issue and is much more concerned about China's growing territorial expansionism and the ideas that underlie that expansionism. That somehow, when China does it, it's okay. And I think the pushback is that that's not okay, and that other countries will resist that. And I think when a country like India raises that at multilateral fora, it gives greater sustenance and viability to the concerns of other smaller nations. And perhaps that's what India intends to do.
And India has been raising that, like you said, at many platforms recently, which is a step in the right direction. And we've seen that there's been a pushback against China from many countries, especially during the times of the pandemic. Now, moving closer home, Harsh, when we look at Afghanistan, the situation there is clearly not okay. There have been a series of attacks, and there's been a recent rocket attack at a time when Mike Pompeo is in talks with the warring factions of the Taliban and trying to come together with a plan which is acceptable to all. The recent attack, the responsibility was claimed by the Islamic State, but we also see that America is withdrawing its troops further and reducing the number by half, say about from 4,500 to 2,500 by probably mid-January, whereas Afghanistan does not want America to withdraw its troops because the situation is clearly not okay, and they want America to put pressure on Taliban to declare a nationwide ceasefire. But the situation is very complicated. Is there a presence of how deep is the presence of Islamic State there, or is just a proxy for Taliban? We know that Imran Khan visited Kabul recently and he did not get a very warm welcome. So how does all this connect?
It's quite interesting. We what Mr. Trump has done last week is to announce this drawdown, which is much faster than many had anticipated, because the deal that was signed earlier this year, talks of complete withdrawal by May 2021. Now, what Mr. Trump has done is now he's saying that, look, I'm going to withdraw, as you mentioned, uh, an extra 2,500 by the inauguration day. And this at a time when domestic politics in America is contested, when Mr. Trump is not conceding, when Mr. Biden is a clear victor, but he does not seem to be getting any reciprocity from the Trump administration in the transition process. So it's quite extraordinary to make that decision. I mean, and that's why there has been a lot of pushback within America. Republicans have senior Republicans have Mitch McConnell are talking that this is not something that President Trump should do in a haste. He should wait and watch and let the next administration take the call. After all, it's not simply a question of withdrawing troops. It's a question of responsible withdrawal of troops, so that you don't end up in a situation where the ground realities become much murkier than they already are. And as you were talking about, we have seen an escalation in violence. We have seen Taliban almost declaring victory, in a seeming assertion that they have won, that they have been able to kick out the American forces. And that perception will create more complications for America, for the region, if the transition process is not handled properly. So I think the withdrawal process is not handled properly. And I think for Mr. Biden, there is a sense that perhaps he might go in for a phased withdrawal, or that he might listen more to what the commanders might say on the ground. So the challenge will be, how do you make this transition as seamless as possible, of withdrawing troops? Now, clearly, the negotiations with the Taliban are, have are stuck at the moment, because there has been no progress as far as I can see since September between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And the Taliban are escalating on the military battlefield because they think that they can win now. Their victory is in sight. So they are putting pressure both on in the diplomatic side of the equation, as well as on the military side of the equation. And I think that's a terrible place for the Afghan government to be in. So clearly, all those stakeholders, including the Afghan government and others who want democracy to thrive in Afghanistan, who wants basic human rights to survive in Afghanistan, are worried. And that is something that American policymakers will have to take into account. And I think this decision potentially can be very irresponsible if it is taken forward by saying that, look, we are just on the back of an envelope kind of an decision that let us withdraw 2,500 troops more till the inauguration day. Uh, the signals it sends out to the Afghan government, the signals it sends out to the Taliban and the Islamic State, the signals it sends out to the regional players, including Pakistan, India, Iran, and Russia, they can be quite far reaching. And I think that's where the real challenge for India lies. How do you read those signals, and how do you manage this process when American policy is also shifting, when American politics is shifting, and when the region has become much more contested, perhaps, than it was in the past.
Of course. And America will probably be able to handle that better once its own domestic problem is settled, once the new administration uh, takes, if the transition process is smooth, and once the new administration is in place, then its policies will be much more clear, and the other countries can read the signal more clearly. That's all we have time for this week. Harsh, thank you so much for the analysis.
Thank you.